Today on Riffs, Beards, and Gear, I attempt to recreate the guitar tone off of Nirvana's Nevermind record. Few albums in my lifetime have had the cultural impact that Nirvana's Nevermind record had. That is significant for me because living in the Seattle area, and I was like 11 or 12 when that album came out, that was the first music that I personally liked that I was allowed to play in the family front room. And In Bloom in particular was a song that made my dad actually perk up from his newspaper and go, "What is this? Can you play that again?" And that meant a lot to me coming from, my dad listened to a lot of, Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin. He generally didn't like anything made past 1981 or 2. And so the fact that he really liked Nirvana spoke mountains to their amazing songwriting capabilities. I am choosing to try to recreate the guitar tone heard on the song In Bloom. Now for the Nevermind record, it's been well documented that Kurt used several different amps, Vox AC30, a Fender Bassman, and his live rig, which was a Mesa Boogie Studio preamp, which I have right here with me, into a Crown Power Bass 2, into a Marshall 412. And people like to assume that it was either a vintage 30 equipped cab or a greenback cab or a T75 cab. Either way, Butch Vig used a selection of 4 different microphones, being a Shure SM57, a Neumann U87, an AKG 414, and sometimes a Sennheiser 421. And depending on whatever song they were working on, Kurt would just pick the combination that he liked best for that particular song, and they would roll with it. So there's a mix and match of a ton of different gear on the album. Now, Kurt initially bought his very first Mesa Boogie Studio preamp on May 2nd, 1990 while on tour, having trashed his Sun Beta Lead heads the night before on May 1st. So he walked into a music store, picked the cleanest sounding amp or preamp presumably, and just went with it. He didn't really think too much about the gear that he chose, but he did choose the Mesa Boogie Studio preamp and he used it for the rest of his life, and it became a live staple, and it was very, very reliable, and it sounded great live. Now what Kurt also used was the Boss DS1 distortion pedal. The Mesa Boogie was set as cleanly as possible, and all of his gain came from the DS1. Now, I've known that for a long time, but when I plugged in to this combination, it didn't sound anything like Kurt's tone. And it took me months to figure out why. These days, it's very commonplace for most guitar cabs to either have some sort of vintage 30 speaker or 30-esque speaker, as that is basically the gold standard for any rock or metal guitar cabinets. Well, back in the 80s, vintage 30s weren't that common and they were fairly new, so it was more common to find something like the Celestion T75 in most speaker cabinets. And you also had Mesa Boogie putting in the C90 in their 412s for the Mark series at the time. So it makes sense that this preamp sounds atrocious into a V30 cab. Believe me, I've tried several of them, miking them up, impulses, all sorts of stuff. Nope, not vintage 30s. It's T75s. And as it turns out, the combination of the DS1 with the Mesa Boogie Studio preamp with the T75-esque speakers, that's the winning combination, and that is what I've used today. So the signal chain that I will be running through today is my custom-made Music Man Stingray RS that I actually spec'd out to kind of resemble Kurt's Mustang in the Smells Like Teen Spirit video, into a Boss DS1, into a Mesa Boogie Studio preamp from 1988. This is a very, very early unit. I think the serial number is 30 or something like that. So early that the input is on the back, not on the front, into a Synergy Sin 50 6L6 100 watt power amp, into a Universal Audio aux top box. Now, I am not using any impulses or speakers in the aux top box. I'm simply using it as a load box to track the DI signal coming off of the preamp and power amp, and I am using impulses in Logic to simulate the speaker combination, which we will get to after you hear my attempt at creating In Bloom. Oh, and lastly, I tuned down a half step because this guitar is down a half step already, and I really wanted to use it. Also, copyright police. So yeah, and also I will point out that Nirvana did tune down a half step for most of their standard stuff later on in the In Utero cycle, so this wasn't uncommon to hear a song like In Bloom down a half step. Anyway, let's get to the song. Okay, so let's dive into the mix of my attempt at the In Bloom guitar tone. I am in Logic Pro X. I have my MIDI bass, my drum MIDI, my 2 guitar DIs, and the reamped track. I'm going to start from top and work my way down towards the bottom. It starts with the bass guitar. The bass guitar tone is actually very, very important. Both in Nirvana, the real record, and this mix. It holds down all of the low end. There's not a ton of low end in Kurt's guitar. For the bass tone, I'm using Easy Bass from Tune Track. I'm using a 70s rock amp preset, and appropriately, it sounds like Chris. It sounds great. I'm doing just a little bit of processing with a UAD, Universal Audio Pultec EQP1A, to add some top end, some snappiness, and to roll off some of the low end. Now onto the drums. I am using Superior Drummer 3, also from Tune Track. I'm using the Pop Punk kit, highly modified. So the snare is an SJC titanium. The tom, so I detuned the snare to closer replicate kind of what was going on the record. Also, since I am a half step down on the bass and the guitar, it made sense. The toms, Mapex prototypes for the rack, and then for the floor tom, it's a Pearl reference, and then an SJC Tour Maple. And I will never ever recreate Dave Grohl in a MIDI drum program. However, I can try, and I'm actually really happy with how the drums turned out, and they sound like this. I'm really happy with how those turned out. They sound great. And finally, the guitars. Again, in the context of a mix. I'm gonna solo the guitars. Now, again, I mixed these in the context of the mix. So by themselves, there's not a ton of low end, and they're kind of fizzy, but it sounds great in the mix. So I'm going to take off all of my processing, and I'm going to note first and foremost that I am using a combination of 4 impulses from ML Sound Lab using the STL Tones Ignite Libra Impulse Response Mixer. 4 different impulses. They're basically different microphones on an ML Mars Marshall cabinet to simulate the different microphones that Butch Vig would have used in the studio. I'm also, so after the cabinet, I am adding a tiny bit of chorus, mixed very low, 16% mix, listening to the raw isolated guitars from the actual recording of In Bloom, there's some chorus going on. And if I put it in the guitar DI, like Kurt would have had it, it didn't sound the way the record sounds, which leads me to believe that there's some sort of post-processing that Andy Wallace may have done. I don't know. I'm just going off of what I'm hearing, and this replicated that very, very well. So right now, with no processing, the guitars sound like this. They're a little too hairy. They're clashing with the bass guitar a little bit. I'm coming in just like Andy. So Andy Wallace would have used his SSL console that he still mixes on today, and that's about it. I tried to stick with that as much as possible. I am using a Universal Audio solid state SSL 4000E channel strip, and it's doing a lot of the heavy lifting. I'm going to play it back, and then I'm going to turn on the channel strip. I'm adding a ton of mid-range, upper mid-range goodness, taking out a lot of the low end. Notice my high and low pass filters are cranked, and I'm adding some mid-range. I'm adding a lot of mid-range. After that, I'm coming in with a Universal Audio EQP 1A Pultec. And I'm gonna switch this off, and I'm gonna switch it in on the playback. I'm adding some low end, and I'm also adding some top end after I'm attenuating the crap out of it. So I'm taking all of the fizziness out and then coming back in and adding some of that more tubey smooth top end, because the DS1 sounds like a buzzsaw, and I want to get rid of that as much as possible. After that, I'm coming in with my old friend, Mr. 1176, to add some levelness. It's not doing a ton, but it is there. And then finally, my tried and true UAD oxide tape is adding the sauce and the bigness to the guitars. I still don't think I nailed it completely, because on the actual track, it's smoother. It's a smoother guitar tone, and the distortion grain of the guitar tone is a little tighter than what I have. I would probably have a better crack at it had I had access to a Marshall 196412 and a bunch of very choice microphones, but I do not have that. Working with the best I can, I kind of captured what I think is somewhere between Kurt's studio tone and Kurt's live tone, because his live tone was fairly different than the album tone, at least in the Nevermind era. So to me, it almost sounds like his live tone, which I'm also very, very cool with and love as well. And there you go. Kurt Cobain's guitar tone for In Bloom off of Nirvana's Nevermind record. If you have any more suggestions for tone recreations, leave them down below in the description. And with that, you have been wonderful. I have been Fluff. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. If you enjoyed the video that you just watched, please consider subscribing. It helps me help you, and then in turn you get more stuff to watch. And also I have all sorts of stuff down in the description of this video. Sweetwater giveaway stuff, there's all sorts of links to all sorts of things, so consider checking that out as well if you're gonna hang. But if you don't hang, all good. I still love you.